Hey, son, pull up a chair. The radiator's clanking the way it always does, and somewhere down the hall a pot of something has been sitting on the stove since before you woke up. It is 1934, and the whole building smells like garlic and Sunday, even though it is only a Wednesday. Tonight we are going somewhere warmer than your landlord's heart. A tenement kitchen in the deep middle of the Depression, where a family of 7 somehow ate like a band of quiet kings on the wages of a man who came home with grease under his nails and almost nothing in his pockets. We are going to talk about food that was born poor and grew up beautiful. And I promise you, it tasted better than anything you stood in line 40 minutes for last week. If this little story keeps you good company tonight, do an old man a favor and tap that like button. Subscribe if you feel like sticking around a while, and leave a comment telling me what your grandmother kept in her good pot, the one she never let anybody touch. We are on Spotify now too, if you would rather close your eyes and just listen. The link is sitting right there in the description, patient as a loaf rising on the windowsill. Now I want you to wonder a few things with me. What did a man do for a glass of wine when the government had decided he could not have one? How did a woman feed a husband, 4 children, and whatever cousin happened to wander up the stairs unannounced, all on a butcher's bill that wouldn't cover your coffee order this morning? Why did the other kids at school hold their noses when you opened your lunch? And why would those same kids sell their souls for that exact sandwich today? And what, exactly, was hanging in the cellar in the dark, down beside the coal, dripping ever so softly, while everyone pretended not to notice? It is 1934 now. The coffee pot is muttering on the back burner. Your mother is wiping her hands on her apron. The bread is cooling on the sill, and everything, every single thing, is about to make sense. Let us start with the morning, before the sun has cleared the rooftops across the street. It is still dark, and the coldest hour of the day has settled into the kitchen, like an unpaying tenant. But your mother is already up, because the coffee does not make itself, and neither does anything else in this house. You hear the soft scrape of the pot on the burner, the small hiss of the gas, the private sounds of a woman who has done this 10,000 times, and will do it 10,000 more. Before the city has said a single word, this kitchen is already awake. She is not making the watery pale stuff that passed for coffee in other people's houses. She is making it the way her own mother made it across the ocean, dark and thick and strong enough to wake the dead and frighten the living. In the leanest weeks, the weeks before payday, she stretched it. A little chicory, a little something burnt and ground to make a small amount of real coffee go further. And not a soul at the table was ever told. You drank it the way it came, and you were grateful, and you did not ask questions you already knew the answer to. You would lie in the next room in the gray dark, and you could chart the whole morning by sound alone. The match struck, the pot set down, the drawer that always stuck, pulled open and shoved shut, and then the smell, which is the thing you would give anything to have back now. That deep brown smell creeping under the door and across the floor and right up onto your pillow, telling you the day had started whether you liked it or not. Your father took his standing up more often than not, one hand around the cup and the other already reaching for his coat. He had a long way to go and a hard thing waiting for him at the end of it, and that one small cup was the entire ceremony he allowed himself. Sometimes he dunked a heel of yesterday's bread into it, and that was breakfast, the whole of it. And he never once complained, because complaining was a luxury, and the family could not afford luxuries. You think about that now, son. When you stand in your own kitchen feeding a little plastic cup into a machine that hisses and spits and hands you something hot in under a minute, you press a button. You do not strike a match. You do not stretch anything, or measure with your eye, or carry it standing up because there is no time to sit. And it is fine, that coffee of yours. It is perfectly fine. But it does not crawl under any doors. It does not wake a whole sleeping family by smell alone. It does not carry the morning on its back the way the battered old pot did. That pot is gone now, of course. It went the way of most things, quietly, when nobody was paying attention. But I can still hear it, the scrape and the hiss, the first sound of every single day of my childhood. Some mornings I wake before the light, the way she always did, and for just a moment, before I am all the way awake, I am sure I can smell it again, drifting down a hallway that has not existed for 60 years. Before the city has said a single word, that kitchen is still awake. Now look around the room you are standing in. The whole apartment has bedrooms and a parlor nobody is allowed to sit in. But make no mistake, the kitchen is where the family actually lives. The stove throws off the only real heat in winter. The table is where you eat, where you do your schoolwork, where your father reads the paper, where your mother rolls out half the things you will hear about tonight. It is the warmest room, the loudest room, the most honest room. If the house had a heart you could hold in your hand, this would be it. The parlor, by contrast, was a kind of museum. It had the good chairs, stiff and cold, covered in something that crinkled when you sat on it, which you were not supposed to do. It had the framed photograph of the relatives back in the old country, staring out grim and unsmiling, judging the lot of you. It was kept clean and dark and ready for company that hardly ever came, and walking through it felt like walking through somebody else's idea of a better life. Nobody warmed themselves in the parlor. Nobody was truly themselves in there. But the kitchen never stopped. There was the stove, the great cast-iron heart of it, fed by gas if you were lucky and by coal if you were not. And it was going from before dawn until long after dark. There was the sink with the one tap, cold water only, where everything got washed, the dishes, the vegetables, the children, sometimes all in the same hour. There was the table in the middle of it all, scrubbed pale and soft, the busiest square footage in the entire city as far as you were concerned. That one table did the work of 10 rooms. In the morning, it was breakfast. By midday, it held your school books and your mother's mending. In the afternoon, it became a workbench where dough got rolled and beans got snapped and 1,000 small things got made by hand. And at night, it was supper. The whole family elbow to elbow, the youngest and the oldest, and everyone in between, talking over each other in 2 languages at once. You learned everything important you ever learned at that table. You just did not know it was a classroom. It was crowded, son. I will not pretend it was not. 7, 8, 9 people, living in rooms you could cross in a few steps, and the kitchen always the fullest room of all. There was no such thing as being alone in it, and no such thing as a secret kept in it. But there was also no such thing as being lonely there, and I have come to think that was the better bargain. I walk through houses now, big ones, with kitchens the size of the whole apartment I grew up in. Stone counters that no knife has ever scarred. Islands you could land a boat on. And so often, so very often, nobody cooks in them. They are beautiful, and they are silent, and the family is scattered through the other rooms staring into little glowing screens. The kitchen has become the showpiece, and the parlor, the place where life actually happens. We got exactly what we wanted, and somewhere in the trade we set down the warmest room in the house and walked off without it. It is mid-morning now, and there is a smell coming up the stairwell that you would know blindfolded in the dark. Bread, real bread, with a crust that cracks like something breaking and a middle soft enough to lose a thumb in. Seca, maybe it came from the bakery on the corner, where the man knew your family by the loaf. Or maybe your mother made it herself, 2 or 3 at a time, because store-bought every day was a luxury for people who had luxuries. There was no such thing as a meal without it. The bread came first, and the bread came every day. The bakery down the block opened before the sun, and the man who ran it had forearms like bridge cables and flour worked so deep into his hands it would never wash out, not in this life. He fired his oven with coal or with wood, a great brick cave of a thing, and the heat of it poured out into the street, so that on a cold morning you could stand near his door and warm yourself for free. You went down with a coin and came back up the stairs holding the loaf against your chest, like a hot brick, and if you were honest, by the time you reached the top, a corner of it had somehow gone missing. That was the great temptation of your whole childhood, son. The heel of a fresh loaf, still warm, the crust shattering under your teeth. You were told to bring it straight home, and you tried. You genuinely tried. But the bread had other ideas. Your mother knew. She always knew. She would look at the loaf, look at you, look at the guilty corner, and say nothing at all, because she had done the very same thing to her own mother 40 years before and 1,000 miles away. When money was short, and money was almost always short, your mother baked her own. She had a feel for it that no recipe could teach, because there was no recipe, only her hands and her memory and the warmth of the room. She knew by the give of the dough when it was ready. She knew by the sound it made when she knocked the bottom of the loaf whether it was done. 2 or 3 loaves at a time, enough for a few days, and the whole apartment turned warm and yeasty and good. And for those hours you would not have traded that kitchen for a king's. Nothing in that house went stale and got thrown away. Nothing. The bread that hardened by the 3rd day did not go in the bin, because there was no such thing as throwing food in the bin. It got dunked in coffee, or floated in soup, or fried in a little oil, or ground down for the next day's cooking. Old bread was not garbage. Old bread was simply bread that was waiting for its second life, and your mother always found it one. I buy bread now in a soft plastic sleeve, sliced by a machine, every slice the exact same as the last, and it will sit on the counter for a week and never change at all, which when you stop and think about it is a deeply unnatural thing for food to do. It does not crack. It does not go properly stale. It does not tempt a single child on a single staircase. It is bread the way a photograph of a fire is a fire. And some mornings I would give a week of my life to climb those stairs one more time, holding something warm against my chest, with a corner already gone. Come out to the back now, or up to the roof, or down to the strip of dirt nobody else wanted, because here is a thing about your people that the whole neighborhood quietly marveled at. An Italian family could grow food anywhere. A fire escape became a farm. A cracked patch of yard behind the building grew tomatoes taller than you were. There was a fig tree wrapped in old coats and tar paper to survive the winter, looking for all the world like a body somebody had hidden. Nothing was too small to plant. Nothing was ever wasted on a patch of bare ground. Your grandfather, who had farmed actual land in the old country before the hunger drove him onto a boat, could not bear the sight of soil sitting empty. It offended something deep in him. So he made gardens out of nothing. Old buckets, wooden crates lined with newspaper, coffee tins with holes punched in the bottom, ranked along the fire escape like a tiny army. The basil came up in a window box. The peppers leaned toward what little sun made it down between the buildings. He coaxed life out of places that had no business growing anything at all. The tomatoes were the great prize, the whole point of the operation. Down in the scrap of yard, or up on the tar-papered roof in the full punishing sun, they grew thick and heavy and red, staked up with whatever wood your grandfather had scavenged that spring. You were sent out to water them, to pinch off the little suckers, to chase away the cats and the pigeons and the neighbor boy who could not be trusted. Those tomatoes were watched more closely than the children, and if I am honest, loved nearly as much. And then there was the fig tree, which deserves a story all its own. A fig tree has no business surviving a northern winter, none at all. But your grandfather would not hear of it. Every autumn, the whole family wrapped that tree, bent it down, bound it in old coats and burlap and tar paper, and tied the whole strange bundle up with rope until it stood in the yard like something out of a nightmare, a wrapped shape the neighbors crossed the street to avoid. And every spring it was unwrapped, and every spring, impossibly, stubbornly, it lived. That tree was the old country, refusing to die in the new one. It was not a hobby, you understand. Nobody gardened for the pleasure of it the way folks do now, with their raised beds and their little gloves and their bags of soil bought from a store. This was food. This was supper. The difference between a thin year and a thinner one. Every tomato, every pepper, every leaf of basil was money your father did not have to earn and your mother did not have to spend, grown out of dirt and sun and pure stubbornness in a place the rest of the city had given up on. I drive past community gardens now, tidy little squares behind chain-link fences, and I see folks tending 6 tomato plants like a precious art project, photographing the harvest, marveling at it. And I do not laugh, son, because they have found something good. But I think of an old man with dirt under his nails who would have wept to see all that good empty ground sitting idle for so long. And I think how he made a farm out of a fire escape and a piece of the old country out of a wrapped and frozen tree, and asked nobody for a thing. It is late summer now, and the heat is the worst of the year. And this is the day the whole family has been waiting for. The tomatoes are ripe all at once, hundreds of them, more than you could eat in a month. And that is exactly the point. Today, you are making the sauce that will get you through the winter. The whole kitchen turns into a small, loud factory. Pots boil, jars are scalded. Everyone has a job, even you, even the littlest one. By nightfall, the shelves are full of red glass, and you have put summer itself into a jar. It did not happen on a calendar day. It happened on the day the tomatoes decided, all together, that they were ready. And when that day came, everything else was canceled. School might have been forgiven. Work was worked around. Word went out to the aunts and the cousins, and by morning the kitchen was full of women with their sleeves rolled up and their hair tied back, and the men hauling crates and bushel baskets up the stairs. The whole apartment groaning under the weight of more tomatoes than seemed possible. The heat was something I cannot fully describe to you. The worst week of August already, and then you light every burner on the stove and keep great pots of water roaring all day long. The windows ran with steam. Your shirt stuck to your back by 9 a.m. and stayed that way. And nobody, not one single soul, suggested stopping, because the tomatoes would not wait and the winter would not forgive you. You worked through the heat because the heat was the price of eating well in February. Everyone had a station and everyone knew it. The tomatoes were washed, then dropped into the boiling water just long enough to loosen their skins, then plunged into cold so the skins slipped right off in your hands. The little ones did the peeling, fingers stained red to the wrist. The women packed the jars and ran the great pot that sealed them. Your grandfather oversaw the whole operation from a chair in the corner, declaring every batch either acceptable or a catastrophe, and being ignored by everyone with great affection. And the smell. Oh, the smell, son. Sweet and sharp and green all at once. The smell of an entire summer breaking down and giving itself up. It got into the curtains. It got into your hair. It hung in that apartment for days afterward, and to this day, if I catch even a trace of it somewhere, I am 6 years old again, with red hands, in a steaming kitchen full of loud women I loved, on the most important day of the year. By the time the light went out of the sky, the shelves down the hall were lined with jars, rank on rank of them, glowing dark red in the last of the daylight, like something precious locked away in a vault, which is exactly what it was. That was the winter sitting on those shelves. Every Sunday sauce, every pot of soup, every cold weather supper, already gathered and put away, while the rest of the city slept. You buy a jar of sauce now in 3 seconds off a shelf, and there is no shame in it, none at all. But you have never spent a brutal August day turning a summer into a winter with your own 2 stained hands, surrounded by your whole family, knowing that what you put up today is what will feed you when the snow comes. We sealed more than tomatoes into that glass. We sealed the whole family in there, and we did not even know it. It is Sunday now, and Sunday has a smell all its own. The sauce went on the stove before church, and it has been murmuring there ever since, low and patient, filling 4 floors of the building with the promise of 1 o'clock. You are not allowed to touch it. You are allowed, if you are very good, to dip a heel of bread into it when your mother is not looking, though she is always looking. This was not a meal. This was the week's whole reason for getting through the week. Everything else was just the waiting. It started early before the family left for Mass, when your mother browned the meat in the bottom of the great pot. Whatever meat there was, and some Sundays, there was precious little. It all went in first to give up its flavor. A few meatballs stretched with bread and made to feed far more people than seemed possible. A piece of tough, cheap meat that needed hours to become tender. A length of sausage if it had been a good week. Then the jarred tomatoes from August went in over the top, and the lid went on, and the long, slow, patient day began. You went to church with that sauce already on your mind. I will confess it. You sat in the pew and you tried to think holy thoughts, and instead, you thought about 1 o'clock. And when you came back up the stairs, the smell met you halfway down the block, rolling out of the building, and every family on the street was sending out the very same signal, so that the whole neighborhood on a Sunday smelled like one enormous kitchen. You knew by the smell alone that you were home, and that you were among your own. It could not be rushed. That was the entire secret, and it was no secret at all. The sauce simmered for hours, 3, 4, 5, the meat going soft inside it, the whole thing thickening and darkening and deepening into something that an hour on the stove could never become. Your mother stirred it now and then with a long wooden spoon, tasted it, frowned, added a pinch of this or that by an instinct older than she was, and put the lid back on. There was nothing to do but wait. The waiting was the recipe. And then, finally, 1 o'clock. The table set with whatever you had. The whole family pulled in from wherever they had scattered, because Sunday dinner was not an invitation. It was a law, and even the cousins who never came for this. The pasta first, dressed in the sauce. Then the meat that had given that sauce its soul, served after. The way it was done. Bread to wipe the plate clean, because you did not leave 1 drop of that sauce behind. Not after it had cost a whole day. You ate until you could not, and then you ate a little more to please your grandmother. It went on for hours, that meal. Nobody jumped up. Nobody had somewhere better to be. The plates were cleared and the talk kept going, and the little ones fell asleep in laps, and the men argued happily about nothing, and the afternoon stretched out long and golden and slow. You order food now, and it arrives at your door in 20 minutes, hot in a paper bag, and you eat it with one eye on a screen. I am not above it, son. But it strikes me sometimes that we have gotten so good at making food fast that we have nearly forgotten the other thing food can do, which is to take all day on purpose and gather a whole family around the waiting. The table is dusted white with flour now, and a small mountain of dough sits in the middle of it. There was no box, no factory, no shelf at the store, not in this house, not on a day that mattered. There was your mother's hands and a rolling pin worn smooth as a stone in a river. She rolled the dough out thin enough to read a newspaper through, then cut it into ribbons, and you draped them over chair backs and broom handles to dry like little flags. You ate something tonight that a machine had never once touched. It began with the simplest things in the whole world. Flour, eggs if there were eggs to spare, water if there were not, and a pinch of salt. That was all. She made a little mountain of the flour right on the bare scrubbed table, dug a well in the middle of it with her fist, and cracked the eggs into the hollow. Then she worked it with her fingers, slowly, drawing the flour into the eggs, until the loose pile became a shaggy mess, and the shaggy mess became a smooth ball. And the whole transformation happened under hands that never once stopped to think about it. Then she kneaded, and this was the part you could not look away from. She put her whole body into it, the heel of her hand driving down and forward, folding and turning, driving down again, over and over, for far longer than seemed necessary. Her face went calm and far away while she did it, somewhere else entirely, and you understood, even as a small boy, that this was not a chore to her. This was a thing her hands knew how to do without her, a thing they had been taught by other hands a long way back, and she was, for those few minutes, in the company of all of them. The rolling was a feat of pure strength and skill. She rolled that ball out wider and wider and thinner, leaning over the table, the pin worn so smooth and so dark with age, it looked like something dug up from the earth. Thin enough, she always said, that you could lay it over a page and read the words straight through, and she was not exaggerating. I have seen it. Then she dusted it, folded it loosely, and cut it across into ribbons with a few quick strokes of a knife, and shook them loose into long golden strands. And then the drying, which turned the whole kitchen into something out of a dream. The cut pasta got draped everywhere, over the backs of chairs, over a broom handle laid across 2 seats, over a clean cloth on the table, hanging down like little curtains, like flags strung up for a holiday nobody had told you about. You were warned, fiercely, not to touch any of it, and you stood and looked at it instead. This kitchen suddenly full of soft pale ribbons swaying in the heat off the stove. What you ate at the end of all that, son, was not the same thing that comes out of a box, and I will not pretend otherwise to be polite. It had a give to it, a softness, a faint taste of the egg and the flour and the hands that made it that no factory has ever once managed. It tasted of an afternoon. It tasted of effort freely given. I buy it dry now in a box, hard and uniform and perfectly fine, and I cook it and I eat it and I am grateful for it. But every so often, standing at the stove, I think of the broom handle laid across 2 chairs, the kitchen hung with little drying flags, and a woman whose hands knew a thing her mind never had to think about, and I miss it like an ache. Let us go down to the cellar now quietly and mind the stairs, because here is one of the truths I promised you. For the early years we are talking about, the government had declared that no man in America could legally have a drink. And yet, down here in the dark, your father and his brothers pressed grapes every autumn into barrels they guarded like newborns, making wine for the table the way their fathers had in the old country. The law looked the other way as long as you kept it at home. So the family kept it at home, and the family kept its mouth shut. Here is the part the school books gloss right over, son. The law that dried out the whole country had a curious little crack in it. A family was allowed to make a fair amount of fruit juice at home for its own use each year. And what happened to that fruit juice after it sat a while in a barrel in a cool, dark cellar was, officially, nobody's business. Italian families across America looked at that crack in the law and looked at the grapes and understood one another perfectly. Wine was not a vice in your house. Wine was food, the same as bread, and no act of Congress was going to take it off your table. So every autumn the grapes came, crates and crates of them, hauled down to the cellar. The railroad cars in the big cities so loaded with grapes bound for Italian neighborhoods that you could smell them coming. The whole family went down into the dark, and the pressing began. And it was hard, sweet, sticky, purple-handed work that went on for days. The men crushed and pressed. The juice ran into the barrels, and the cellar filled up with a smell so thick and sweet and alive you could nearly chew it. Then came the waiting, which was its own kind of religion. The barrels sat in the cool dark and did their slow secret work, and your father went down to check on them the way a worried man checks on a sleeping child, listening, tasting, fussing. The cellar in those months smelled of damp stone and sweet fermentation and the coal piled in the corner. And it was, to a small boy allowed down on rare occasions, the most mysterious and grown-up place in the entire world. Nobody made a fuss about it, you understand. There were no labels, no fancy talk, no swirling of the glass and closing of the eyes the way folks carry on now. The wine came up from the cellar in a plain jug and went on the table next to the bread, and the men drank it with supper, and even the children got a little, cut heavily with water, because that was simply how it was done, where your family came from. It was not a treat. It was not an occasion. It was Tuesday. And it was good, that homemade wine, in the way that honest things are good. Rough sometimes, different every year, but it was your father's, made with his own hands from grapes he had pressed himself, costing almost nothing, served to people he loved. And there has never been a bottle on any shelf in any store that could touch it. You walk into a shop now, son, and there are 1,000 bottles waiting, from every corner of the earth, more wine than your father saw in his whole life, and you may have any of it for a few dollars and a moment of your time. And it is a fine thing, I suppose, this easy abundance. But none of it was pressed by hands you loved, in a dark cellar, half in defiance of the law, and so none of it will ever taste like that plain jug on that plain table. Some things you cannot buy. You can only be given them, and then spend the rest of your life remembering. You are still in the cellar, so let your eyes adjust. Up there, hanging from the beams in the cool and the dark beside the coal pile, are shapes you might mistake for something terrible if you did not know better. Salami, soppressata. Sausages your father made himself after the cold weather came, hung up to cure for months, dripping their fat in slow, patient drops onto the floor. This was money in the bank. For a family that did not trust banks, and after 1929, you can hardly blame them. You ate the autumn's work all the way through to spring. It happened when the weather turned, never before, because the cold was part of the recipe. When the first real chill came and the cellar went properly cool, the family bought a pig, or a part of one, or went in with the cousins on a whole hog, and then the work began. Nothing was wasted. Not one scrap of that animal went unused, because waste was a thing only rich people could afford, and your family was not rich. The good cuts were eaten fresh and celebrated. Everything else was ground, seasoned, and stuffed by hand into casings, twisted off into links, and carried down to the dark. Your father seasoned it by memory, by taste, by the particular pinch of his own fingers, the way his father had taught him with no measurements written down anywhere. Salt, of course, a great deal of it, because the salt was what kept the meat from turning. Pepper, garlic, maybe a little of the wine from the barrels in the corner. He mixed it, and he tasted a tiny bit raw, frowning, and he adjusted. And when it was right, he simply knew, the same way your mother knew when the bread was done. Then up they went on the beams, and the long, patient wait began again. Because this whole cellar, son, was a place where the family practiced patience as a kind of faith. The sausages hung in the cool dark for weeks and months, slowly drying, slowly firming, slowly turning from soft fresh meat into something dense and deep and concentrated. The fat dripped now and then, soft little sounds in the dark. The smell of it mixed with the wine and the coal and the damp stone into something I have never smelled anywhere else in my life. That hanging meat was wealth, the realest wealth the family had. Not money, which could vanish in a single bad week, as everyone had just learned the hard way, when the banks went down and took people's savings with them. This was wealth you could see and touch and eat. It hung there as proof that no matter how thin the coming months got, there would be something to put on the bread, something to flavor the beans, something to make a poor supper feel like a rich one. A family with a full cellar could look the winter in the eye, and it was rationed with great care, slice by careful slice, made to last, from the autumn slaughter all the way through to the spring. A little went a long way. A few thin slices of that soppressata, dense and salty and deep, could turn a plate of plain bread into a feast. And you savored every bit of it because you knew exactly how much work hung between you and the next pig. You buy it now at a counter, sliced paper thin by a humming machine, as much as you like, any day of the week, and it is good, and I will not say otherwise. But it did not hang in your own cellar through a long cold winter. It was not your father's hands that seasoned it and your father's patience that made it. It is food, that store-bought meat. What hung in our cellar was something closer to a promise, kept in the dark, that the family would make it through to spring. Stay with me down here, because there is one more secret in the dark. Some families, the ambitious ones, the stubborn ones, made their own cheese. A pot of milk, a little rennet, a square of cheesecloth, and patience nobody seemed to be short of. Fresh ricotta that was gone by morning, a harder cheese set to age on a wooden shelf turned by hand, watched like a sleeping child. You did not buy what you could make, and you could make almost everything. And what you could not make you traded for with somebody on the third floor who could. The fresh cheese was the everyday miracle, and it was the simplest thing in the world to watch and the hardest to believe. Your mother warmed a great pot of milk on the stove, slow and careful, never letting it scorch, and at just the right moment she added the thing that turned it, a little rennet, or sometimes only a splash of something sour. And then, before your eyes, the milk did the impossible. It parted. It separated into soft white curds and thin watery whey, the whole pot transforming into two things, where a moment before there had been one. To a child, it looked like a magic trick. To your mother, it was Tuesday. She ladled the curds into a cloth and let them drain. And what was left when she was done, if you were lucky enough to be standing there, was a bowl of fresh ricotta still warm from the pot, soft and sweet and clean-tasting, unlike anything that has ever come out of a plastic tub. On a day she made it, she might spread it on bread with a little salt, or fold it into something for supper, or simply let the children eat it warm with a spoon. And there was nothing in this world a small boy wanted more than to be in the kitchen on a day the cheese got made. And here is the truest thing about that house, son. Nothing got thrown away, not even the watery whey that was left over once the curds were lifted out. Other people would have poured it down the drain without a thought. Your mother poured it back into the pot and worked another small bit of cheese out of it, because the whey still had a little goodness left in it, and a little goodness was never ever wasted in that kitchen. You learned without anyone ever saying it out loud that there is almost always one more use in a thing if you are willing to bother. The harder cheeses were a longer game, a thing of months, and they lived down in the cool, dark cellar with the wine and the hanging meat, that whole underground larder where the family kept its treasures. A round of cheese was set on a wooden shelf to age, salted, turned by hand every few days so it ripened evenly, watched over and fussed about. It was guarded against mice and damp and impatient children. And when it was finally ready, grated sparingly over a Sunday plate, a little of it carried the flavor of all those patient months. What the family could not make, it traded for, because the whole neighborhood ran on a quiet web of swapping that no money ever touched. Your mother's bread for the cheese from the woman on the third floor. A jar of sauce for a length of someone's sausage. Eggs for a favor for a loaf. Nobody wrote any of it down. Everybody simply remembered, and everybody came out ahead, and a family with empty pockets could still eat like it had full ones. I open my refrigerator now, and there are cheeses from half the countries of the earth in there, bought without a second thought, and I am grateful, truly. But not one of them parted before my eyes in a pot on the stove. Not one of them was made by hands I loved, or traded for with a neighbor whose name I knew, or watched over in the dark for months like something alive. We have so much now, son. I only wonder some days whether we still know how to make any of it ourselves. Back up the stairs now and out onto the street where the real market is. Forget the idea of a store with a door and a register. The market was the curb itself, lined with wooden push carts heaped with whatever was cheap and in season, each one shouted over by a man who could out-yell a fire engine. You learned to haggle before you learned to read. You learned which vendor patted his thumb on the scale and which one slipped an extra peach to a child. The whole block was a single noisy living thing, and your mother moved through it like a general. It started early and it was already roaring by the time you got there. The carts lined both curbs as far as you could see, pushed into place before dawn by men who had hauled them from somewhere and would haul them back at dark. And every cart was its own small shop. Tomatoes on this one, dark and dented and cheap because dented sold for less. Greens on that one, still wet. Fish on another, packed in ice and smelling of the sea 2 states away. Cheese, bread, oil, nuts. A man selling nothing but lemons. A man selling nothing but eggs from a basket. The whole list of your supper spread out down the length of one shouting street. And the noise, son. I cannot make you hear it, but I can try. Every vendor crying out his prices and his wares at the top of his lungs, half of them in Italian, the rest in whatever English they had picked up. All of it at once. A wall of sound you walked straight into. Carts rattling over the cobbles. Women calling back and forth. The whole street alive and arguing and bargaining and laughing. A place that was as much a daily meeting hall as it was a market, where the news of the neighborhood traveled cart to cart faster than any newspaper. Your mother did not simply buy things here. She negotiated. She knew the going price of every item to the penny, and she knew it had been a little high the moment a man said it, and she let him know she knew, and a kind of friendly war broke out that both of them secretly enjoyed. She picked up the tomato, frowned at it, set it down, picked up another. She walked away once or twice on purpose and was called back. By the time she was done, she had paid exactly what the thing was worth, and not 1 cent more. And the vendor respected her for it, because anyone who paid the first price he named was a fool, and everyone knew it. You went along to carry the bags and to learn, though you did not know you were learning. You learned which man could be trusted and which one to watch. You learned that the bruised fruit at half the price was often the better buy if you were going to cook it that night anyway. You learned to look a grown man in the eye and tell him his price was too high, which is a thing a child does not forget. The market was your first school, and the lessons were about money and people and the worth of things, and they stuck. You order your groceries now on a little glowing screen, son, and a stranger leaves them in bags at your door. And you never haggle, never argue, never look anyone in the eye, never learn which vendor to trust, because there are no vendors anymore, only prices that do not move. It is a marvel of convenience, I know. But I think of that roaring street, that single living arguing thing, and I wonder what we quietly gave up when we made buying our food so silent. Step into the butcher shop now and breathe in the sawdust and the cold. Here is another hard and beautiful truth. The good cuts, the ones the rich folks across town bought without a second thought, those were not for you. But your mother did not want them, or so she would have told you. And the wonderful part is that she was not entirely lying. She wanted the tripe, the tongue, the feet, the cheap forgotten organs the butcher nearly gave away. And in her hands, after hours on the stove, those scraps became something the rich folks never once got to taste. The shop itself is a memory I can call up whole. The sawdust on the floor to soak up what dripped, the cold that lived in the place even in summer, the carcasses hanging on hooks in the back, the great wooden blocks scarred white by 10,000 cuts, the butcher in his apron with his cleaver and his terrible cheerful jokes. He knew your family. He knew what you could spend, which was not much, and he steered your mother toward the cheap end of the case without ever once making her feel small about it, because half his customers were in the very same boat. The fine cuts went by in the cold case, and your mother walked right past them, and not always sadly. The thick steaks, the proper roasts, those were for people whose lives you read about and did not live. What she stopped for was the rest. The tripe, the honeycomb stomach that turned, after long slow cooking, into something rich and tender that warmed you to your boots. The tongue, which sounds a fright to you now, but ate like the most velvet thing imaginable once she was through with it. The feet, the knuckles, the cheap bony bits that other people threw to dogs, all of which gave up their goodness into a pot if you only gave them the time. That was the entire secret of it, son, and it is a secret the whole world has since paid good money to relearn. The cheap cuts were cheap because they were difficult. They were tough, or strange, or they took hours and hours of patient low cooking to become tender. And the rich, who had no need to bother, never bothered, and so they never found out that the hardest cuts in the right hands became the deepest and most flavorful food on the whole animal. Your mother had nothing but time and necessity, and out of those two poor ingredients she made suppers that I would trade a fine steak for today without a moment's thought. Nothing was beneath her and nothing was wasted. The bones went into the pot for broth. The fat was rendered and saved in a tin for cooking. The bits too small for anything else got ground and stretched into something. An animal that a wealthy family used a quarter of, your mother used entirely, down to the very last usable scrap, and fed more people with the cheap 3/4 than the rich family fed with the expensive one. You go to a restaurant now, son, a fancy one, and there on the menu, for a startling price, is the very tripe your mother bought for pennies, the very tongue, the same humble organ meats, described in beautiful words and served to people who consider themselves adventurous for ordering them. And I smile every time, and I say nothing, because my mother knew 60 years ago what they have only just discovered. The best of the animal was always hiding in the parts nobody wanted, waiting for someone poor enough and patient enough and clever enough to find it. It is a bright afternoon now, and your mother has handed you a paper sack and pointed you toward the empty lot at the end of the block. You are going to pick dinner. Dandelion greens, the bitter wild kind that grew up through the cracks for free, that your neighbors mowed down as weeds without ever knowing what they were throwing away. You picked the youngest leaves, the tender ones, and your mother cooked them down with a little garlic and a little oil until the whole bitter, free wild thing turned soft and good. Supper, gathered from a place nobody else thought to look. She taught you which ones to take, because not every green thing was food, and a child needs to be shown. The dandelion, before it flowered, when the leaves were young and tender, and not yet gone tough and savage with bitterness. The wild chicory that grew along the fences, the tender shoots of this and the young leaves of that. A whole quiet menu growing for free in the places the city had forgotten. The empty lots and the cracked edges of the sidewalk and the weedy strip along the railroad, all of it invisible to everyone but the people who knew. And that was the thing, son. To your neighbors, the ones who had been here a generation or two longer, these were weeds, nuisances, things to be cut down and cursed and hauled away. They mowed them, they pulled them, they poisoned them when they could, and they never once suspected that the immigrant family down the hall was quietly gathering those very weeds into a paper sack and turning them into supper. There is no better picture of the whole story I am telling you tonight than that. One man's weed was your mother's vegetable, and the difference between them was only knowledge, carried across an ocean, of what the land was actually offering for free. You picked them young and you picked them clean, shaking off the dirt, leaving the toughest stalks, filling the sack with the tender leaves. And there was a strange dignity in it, even though the family was poor and these were greens scrounged from a vacant lot. You were not begging, you were not taking charity. You were gathering food that grew wild and free for anyone with the eyes to see it, the same as your people had done in the old country for longer than anyone could remember, and there was an old, deep self-respect in that. At home, your mother cooked them down the only way she ever cooked a green thing, which was also the best way anyone has ever found. A little oil in the pan, a clove or two of garlic, maybe a pinch of dried pepper for heat, and the greens piled in wet and wild and bitter, cooking down and down until the whole defiant mass went soft and dark and tender. The bitterness did not vanish, not entirely, but it mellowed into something good, something grown up, something that woke up your whole mouth. With a piece of bread to go alongside, that was a supper, and a fine one. You can buy those very greens now, son, in the nice grocery store, washed and bundled and sold by the pound at a price that would have made your mother laugh until she cried. Bitter greens, the label says, as though it were a delicacy, which I suppose it now is. And I buy them sometimes, and I cook them in the oil and the garlic exactly as she did, and they are good. But they did not come out of a forgotten lot at the end of the block, gathered free by a boy with a paper sack who did not yet know he was being handed the oldest lesson there is. It is the lean middle of the week now, the days that test a family, the days before payday, when the jar on the shelf is getting light. This is when you find out what your mother is really made of, because she can take a single pound of dry macaroni, a thing that costs almost nothing, and turn it into a supper that fills 7 stomachs and leaves nobody feeling poor. A little oil, a little garlic, a handful of whatever was around. That was the whole genius of it. Cheap food, yes, but never, not once, a cheap meal. The dry macaroni was the foundation that the whole week stood on, even in the hardest stretch, even when the meat was gone and the good cheese was being guarded and the money was down to coins. There was always pasta in the house, because pasta kept forever in its paper and cost so little that to be without it was almost unthinkable. It did not spoil. It did not go bad waiting for you. It sat patient in the cupboard, a sack of pure possibility. And on the thinnest night of the week, your mother reached for it and made magic out of almost nothing. The simplest supper she made, and one of the finest, was nothing but pasta, oil, garlic, and thyme. She warmed good oil slowly in the pan, laid in the sliced garlic, and let it go gold and fragrant without ever letting it burn. Because burnt garlic was the one unforgivable sin in that kitchen. A pinch of dried pepper, perhaps, for those who liked a little fire. The boiled pasta tossed in to drink up all that flavored oil. A little of the precious grated cheese over the top, if there was any to spare. And that was it. 4 things and the skill to combine them, and you had a plate that was somehow far greater than what had gone into it. When there was a little more to work with, she stretched it further still. A few of the August tomatoes from the shelf, a handful of those bitter greens you had gathered, a heel of the hard cheese grated down to dust, a scrap of the cellar sausage chopped fine so that a little flavored a lot. She could look into a nearly empty cupboard, take stock of the 4 sad things that remained, and in her head assemble them into a supper, and then make it real on the stove in the time it took the pasta to cook. It was a kind of intelligence that no school ever tested and no diploma ever recognized, and it was as real as any I have ever seen. And here is the part that matters most, son. You never knew. Sitting at that table on a lean Wednesday, eating a plate of pasta dressed in nothing but oil and garlic and cleverness, you did not feel poor. You did not feel like you were being made to do without. You felt fed and warm and cared for, because your mother had taken the cheapest things in the world and, by the pure force of her skill and her love, made them taste like enough. That is the closest thing to alchemy I have ever witnessed in this life. You stand in front of a full pantry now, son. More food in it than that family saw in a month. And on a tired night, you stare into all that abundance and declare that there is nothing to eat. Nothing to eat. I have heard you say it, and I have bitten my tongue. Because your great-grandmother could have fed this whole family for 3 days on what you call nothing, and made every plate of it taste like a small act of love, with a single pound of macaroni and a little imagination. Sit down at the table, because here comes the dish that kept whole neighborhoods alive. Pasta and beans, the 2 cheapest things in the cupboard, cooked together into something thick and warm, and somehow far greater than the sum of what went into it. Your richer schoolmates would have wrinkled their noses. You knew better. You knew that a bowl of this on a cold night, with a heel of bread to wipe it clean, was as close to wealthy as a body needed to feel. The poorest supper in the house, and somehow one of the best. The beans were the other thing, alongside the pasta, that a family could always afford. Dried in a sack, costing almost nothing, keeping forever in the cupboard, swelling up to many times their size once you soaked them, so that a small handful became a potful. They were poor people's food in every country on earth, and your people had been making art out of them for 1,000 years before they ever crossed the ocean. And they did not stop just because they had landed somewhere new and hard. Your mother soaked them overnight in a bowl of water, where they sat plumping while the family slept, and in the morning they had doubled and were ready for the slow pot. Then they cooked low and long, the way everything good in that kitchen cooked, with a clove of garlic, a little oil, maybe a bone saved from some earlier meal thrown in to give it depth, maybe a single tomato from the shelf, maybe nothing more than salt. The beans went soft and creamy. The liquid they cooked in turned thick and rich all on its own. And near the end she threw in a handful of pasta, often the broken bits saved from the bottom of other boxes, because broken pasta was still pasta and nothing was wasted. What came out of that pot, son, was a thing I still dream about, thick enough that the spoon would nearly stand up in it. Creamy from the beans, savory from the garlic and oil, the little bits of pasta soft and yielding throughout. It cost almost nothing, and it filled you up like a feast, and it warmed you from the inside out on a cold night the way no fancy dish ever has. A heel of bread dragged around the bowl got the last of it, and you would not have left a single bean behind for a king's ransom. It was the food of having nothing, and your family ate it without shame, because there was no shame in it, only sense. Your wealthier classmates, the ones whose lunches you envied, would have turned up their noses at a bowl of beans and broken pasta. Poor food, they would have called it, and walked away. And they would have walked away from one of the most perfect, nourishing, soul-warming suppers ever invented by hungry people anywhere, never knowing what they had passed up. Their loss was complete, and they never even felt it. That is the brutal truth at the bottom of so much of this, son, the thread running under the whole story. The food born of having nothing was very often the best food there was. Hunger and poverty turned out to be remarkable teachers, and your people had studied under them for generations. And the lessons they learned are the very dishes that fine restaurants now serve for startling prices to people who call them rustic and authentic. You knew that warm, thick bowl when it cost a few pennies and meant survival. I am not sure the people paying $20 for it now know it half as well. Now, if your family came down from the north of the old country, there is another dish on the table tonight, and it is poured, not plated. Polenta. Cornmeal stirred forever over the fire until your mother's arm ached, then turned out steaming onto a wooden board in the middle of the table. There were no separate plates for it. Everyone ate from the same board, working in from their own edge, the whole family bent over one golden steaming circle. You could top it with almost anything or nothing at all, and it would still warm you straight through to the bones. It came from the north, where the families could not always grow the wheat for pasta and bread the way they did farther south, but where the corn grew, and so corn became the staff of life instead. Ground down into a coarse golden meal, it cost next to nothing. It filled you up completely. And it had kept poor mountain families alive through hard northern winters for longer than anyone could say. Your people carried that knowledge across the ocean the same as they carried everything else, in their hands and their memory. And on a cold night, the pot came out. The making of it was pure labor, and there was no shortcut to be had. The cornmeal went into boiling water in a slow, steady stream while your mother stirred. And then she stirred, and then she kept stirring, on, for what felt to a watching child like an hour, because the moment she stopped, the whole pot would seize into lumps, and the work would be ruined. Round and round the wooden spoon went, the polenta thickening and bubbling and spitting like something volcanic, until her arm ached and her face went red with the heat of the fire. And still she stirred, because that was the price of it. And then came the part that made it unlike any other supper in the week. There were no plates. Your mother carried the heavy pot to the table and turned the whole steaming golden mass out onto a clean wooden board in the center, where it spread into a great soft circle, gleaming, breathing steam up into the cold air of the room. A little sauce ladled over it if there was sauce, a little cheese grated on if there was cheese, a few scraps of the cellar sausage if it was a fortunate night, and on a poor night nothing at all but the polenta itself, plain and golden and good. Then the whole family gathered close around that one board and ate, each from the edge nearest to them, working inward toward the middle. No plates, no separate portions, just one shared circle of food and 7 spoons reaching into it. There was a closeness in that I have never felt at any other table since. You could not eat from a communal board and feel like a separate person. You were one mouth among many, all fed from the same gold circle, all leaning in toward the same warm center, and the boundary between you and the rest of the family simply dissolved for the length of the meal. We each eat off our own plate now, son, at our own place, often in our own room, often at our own hour. The family scattered through the house like marbles dropped on a floor. And we call it freedom, I suppose, and maybe it is. But I think of that one steaming board in the middle of a cold kitchen, and 7 people bent over it together, sharing one supper out of one circle. And I am not entirely sure that what we traded it for was worth the trade. Let me show you the one thing in this kitchen that was guarded like a jewel. The olive oil. It came across an ocean from the old country in tins, and it cost real money. And so it was used the way you use a thing you cannot easily replace. A drizzle, a spoonful, a careful pour measured by an eye that had been measuring it for 40 years. For everyday cooking, you used lard. You used whatever fat the kitchen made on its own. But the oil, the good green gold, that was for when something mattered. And in this house, on the right day, everything mattered. It came in tins, the real oil, shipped all the way from the groves of the old country, because the good oil could not be had any other way, and your family would not have trusted any substitute even if it could. It cost dearly, more than a poor family could easily spare. And so it arrived as something between a grocery and a treasure, and it was put away with care, and it was guarded. There was a particular tin, and a particular place it lived, and the children understood without being told that this was not a thing to be wasted or spilled or used carelessly. So the family lived a sensible double life when it came to fat, the way poor, clever families always do. For the everyday cooking, the frying, the greasing of the pan, the bulk of the week's work, you used lard, or you used the fat rendered and saved from the meat, kept in a tin by the stove and spooned out without a second thought because it cost nothing. The cheap fat did the heavy daily labor. It was the workhorse. And the good oil was spared all of that, kept back, held in reserve for the moments that deserved it. Because the oil was not for cooking, not really, not the precious stuff. The oil was for finishing, for the final touch, for the moment a dish was already made and needed one last grace note. A thread of it drizzled over the soup at the table. A spoonful stirred raw into the beans just before they were served. A little poured over the bitter greens or the fresh ricotta, where you could actually taste it, peppery and green and alive, the whole sunlit hillside of some far-off grove captured in a single bright spoonful. Cooked away in a hot pan, that magic would have been lost, and so the family never lost it. Your mother measured it with her eye, never with a spoon, a quick, controlled pour, and then a sharp tip of the wrist to stop it. A motion so practiced it looked like nothing at all, and was in fact the result of 40 years of being careful with a costly thing. She knew exactly how much a dish could have, and exactly how much the tin could spare. And she balanced those two numbers in her head 100 times a week without ever once thinking about it consciously. To watch her pour the oil was to watch thrift and generosity arguing, and somehow both of them winning. You buy it now by the great bottle. Son, good oil from a dozen countries, cheap enough that you pour it into the pan without a thought and cook it away to nothing and never feel the loss. And there is no crime in that, I know. But I think there is something we lost along with the scarcity. When a thing is precious, you taste it. You pay attention. You save it for the moment it can do the most good. My mother's tin of green gold taught me that almost everything worth having is worth being careful with. And I am not sure a cupboard full of cheap bottles teaches anybody that at all. The plates are cleared now, but nobody is leaving the table because the meal is not actually over. Out comes the little pot, the one that makes the coffee thick and black and strong enough to stand a spoon up in. Tiny cups, the kind that look like a joke in a grown man's hand. This was not the watery stuff from the morning. This was the period at the end of the sentence, the signal that now the family could simply sit and talk and let the afternoon stretch out. The little cup said the same thing every time. Stay. There is no hurry. It came out after the food was done and the plates were stacked, when a lesser family might have scattered to their separate corners, but not yours. The little pot went on the burner, and everyone understood that the most important part of the meal, in some ways, was only now beginning. This was not the coffee that started the day and chased your father out the door. This was the coffee that ended the meal and held the family in their chairs. And the difference between the two was the difference between a starting gun and a closing hymn. The cups themselves were tiny, almost comically so, little vessels that disappeared into your father's working hands, holding no more than a few good swallows of coffee so concentrated and dark it was nearly a syrup. You did not gulp it. You could not have if you tried. You sipped it slowly, making the small amount last, and that was precisely the design of the thing, because a tiny cup of strong coffee sipped slowly buys you a long stretch of sitting and talking, which was the entire point. The smallness was not stinginess. The smallness was an invitation to linger. The men took theirs sometimes with a single drop of something stronger stirred in, a little anise liqueur or whatever was about, a small grown-up ritual the children watched with great interest and were not allowed to share. They would settle deeper into their chairs, the cup steaming, the talk turning slow and easy, the arguments of the meal softening into agreement, the whole table sliding into that warm, full, contented hour that comes only after good food among people you love. The little cup sat in front of them, refilled once, maybe twice, in no hurry at all. And the talk, son. The talk was the real meal, when you get right down to it. The food brought everyone to the table, but the little cup of coffee kept them there long after the eating was done, and it was in that long, lingering hour that the actual life of the family happened. The old stories got told again. The news got passed around. The children fell asleep against somebody's arm. The arguments and the laughter and the plans and the memories, all of it unspooling slowly over those tiny cups. The afternoon stretching out long and golden, because nobody had anywhere they would rather be. You drink your coffee on the move now, son, in a great paper cup the size of a small bucket, carried out the door, gulped between one task and the next, finished and thrown away, before you have so much as sat down. It is fuel, that coffee. It is something you consume in order to do something else. And the little cup at the end of our meals was the opposite of fuel entirely. It was a break, gently applied. It was a way of telling a whole family, every single day, that the work was done now and the people were here, and there was, for one golden hour, absolutely no hurry at all. Here is a thing that is hard to explain to a child of your time, who can buy a cake at any hour of any day. In this house, sweets were not an everyday thing. They were a calendar. The fried honey balls came at Christmas, and only at Christmas. The little fig cookies came once a year, and then were gone. Dessert most nights was a piece of fruit, or nothing at all, and so when the real sweets finally arrived, they meant something. You did not gobble them. You understood, even as a small boy, that you were tasting a holiday itself. Sugar cost money, and so did the butter and the nuts and the honey and the long hours of skilled work that the good sweets demanded. And a family counting its pennies did not spend those things on an ordinary Tuesday. Most nights, if there was anything sweet at the table at all, it was fruit. An orange, split and shared. A few figs from the wrapped tree out back when the season gave them. A handful of nuts cracked open by hand around the table. And that was plenty, and nobody felt cheated, because the truly sweet things were being saved for the days that earned them. And the calendar told you exactly when those days were coming. The fried honey balls, little golden pieces of dough piled into a sticky sweet mountain and drizzled with honey, those belonged to Christmas, and the first sight of them meant the holiday had truly arrived. The light crisp fritters appeared in the spring, around the feast of the carpenter saint in the middle of March, and not at any other time. The little cookies stuffed with figs and nuts came once a year, and then vanished for 12 long months. Each sweet had its season, its single appointed time, and outside of that time, you simply did without and waited. The making of them turned the kitchen into a kind of holy workshop. The good sweets were difficult, fussy, time-consuming, and they were made in great batches by the women working together, the air thick with the smell of frying dough and warming honey and toasting nuts. You were allowed to help a little and to sneak a little, and the whole apartment filled up with a sweetness that came around so rarely that to this day a certain smell can put me right back there, small and eager, hovering at the edge of the table waiting to be handed something warm. And because they came so rarely, son, you tasted them, truly tasted them, in a way that is almost impossible now. A single one of those honey balls eaten slowly was an event, a small sacred thing, a flavor you had waited an entire year for and would have to wait another entire year to taste again. You did not shovel them in. You savored them, you made them last. You understood in your bones that this sweetness was rare and precious and tied to this one holy day. And that understanding made it taste 1,000 times better than any everyday sweet ever could. You can buy any sweet you can imagine now, son, at any hour, on any ordinary day, more sugar in arm's reach than that whole family saw in a year. And so no sweet means very much anymore, because nothing rare is ever truly rare when you can have it whenever you like. We won that battle completely. We made sweetness endless and cheap and always available. And in the winning of it, I think, we quietly lost the thing my mother's honey balls had, which was the power to make a single small bite taste like an entire holiday, because you had waited a whole year and earned it. It is a Friday now, and there is no meat on this table, because the church said so, and your grandmother said so louder. Fish instead, and the family made a feast of it without complaint. But the real story is Christmas Eve, the long holy night when your mother cooked not one fish, but a whole sea of them, dish after dish after dish, the kitchen wild with the smell of it for hours. No meat would touch a single plate that night, just the fish and the candles and the whole family waiting together for midnight to come. Every Friday, the meat disappeared from the table, because the church had said for centuries that the faithful did not eat meat on a Friday, and your grandmother enforced that rule with a devotion that made the church itself look casual. So Friday was a fish day, and the family ate fish without grumbling, often the salt cod that came stiff and dry and strange, and had to be soaked for days in changes of water to come back to life, transforming from a board-hard slab into something tender and good. Poor people's fish, preserved and cheap, made delicious by patience. The same story as everything else in this kitchen. But the Fridays were only the rehearsal for the one great night the whole year built toward Christmas Eve. The long holy vigil, when the rule against meat became not a hardship, but the foundation of the single most magnificent meal of the entire calendar. On that night, by old and unshakable tradition, the family ate fish, only fish, but fish in such abundance and variety that it left the simple Friday suppers far behind. Dish after dish after dish of it, course following course following course, the table groaning under the weight of the sea. The kitchen on that day was a place of wonderful controlled chaos that began before dawn and did not let up until the food hit the table. The salt cod soaking and frying, the little smelts crisping in hot oil. The eel, which was the strangest and most traditional of all, prepared in the old way that the children half feared and half adored. Clams, snails, whatever the family could gather and afford, each one its own dish, each one cooked with the full attention it deserved, the whole apartment filled for hours, with the briny wild smell of an entire ocean passing through one small kitchen. And then the meal itself, which went on and on into the night, course after course, the family gathered in their best, the little ones fighting to stay awake, everyone eating slowly because there was so much and the night was so long, and there was nowhere on earth any of them would rather be. It was a feast built entirely out of a rule meant to deny you something, the prohibition on meat turned by your clever devout people into the richest table of the year. And that, son, tells you almost everything you need to know about where you come from. Give these people a restriction, and they will make a celebration out of it. You eat fish now whenever the mood takes you, son. Flown in fresh from anywhere, no rule requiring it, no season governing it, no holy night giving it meaning, and it is fine, and it is easy, and it is forgettable. But I remember a kitchen wild with the smell of the sea on the holiest night of the year, a whole family waiting together through course after course for the bells of midnight, a feast made gloriously out of the very thing we were told we could not have. We do not deny ourselves anything anymore, and I sometimes wonder if that is exactly why so little of it feels like a feast. Now I have to tell you the part that stings, because I promised you the truth, and not just the pretty pieces of it. Oh, you took your lunch to school in a pail, and inside it was the food I have been describing to you all night. Food made with love and garlic and oil. And the other children held their noses. They called your people names I will not repeat in this kitchen. They thought your food was strange, dirty, lesser. You learned to be ashamed of the very thing that, years later, the whole country would line up around the block to eat. Your mother packed that pail with the best she had, you understand, and that is what makes it ache to remember. A thick heel of her own bread split open and filled with whatever the cellar offered, a little of the cured meat she had hung and tended through the winter. Roasted peppers gone sweet and soft, swimming in a little of that precious oil. A wedge of cold frittata, eggs and greens and a bit of cheese, fried the night before and saved. It was real food, food with flavor and history in it, and she sent it with you as an act of love. But at the long table in the schoolroom, surrounded by children whose mothers packed pale soft sandwiches on store bread with the crust cut off, that pail became a source of pure misery. You would open it and the smell would rise up, the garlic and the oil and the cured meat, the honest deep smell of your own home, and the children nearest you would wrinkle their faces and pull away and say things. They held their noses. They laughed. They called you and your family the names that were thrown at Italians in those years. Ugly words I will not say at this table. Words meant to tell you that you were less, that you were dirty, that you did not belong. And so you did a thing that breaks my heart to tell you about, son. You began to be ashamed. You, a small boy, ashamed of your own mother's cooking, of the food she had made with such care out of such little, because the world outside your door had taught you that it marked you as something to be looked down on. Some children begged for the pale soft sandwiches the other kids had. Some hid their pails or ate facing the wall, or threw the good food away rather than be seen with it. The shame got inside you young, and it did not let go easily. That is the brutal truth right at the center of all of it, the hard stone under all the warmth. This food, This glorious food was not always loved. It was mocked. It was used as a weapon against the people who made it. To be Italian in those years was for a time to be told that everything about you, right down to what you ate for lunch, was wrong. And a great many children learned to swallow that lie along with their shame and to wish they were something other than what they were. But here is the turn, son, and it is a sweet one. Those very children who held their noses, they grew up, and their own children and the whole country with them came around at last to line up around the block and pay good money and call your mother's exact food the most beloved cooking in America. The garlic they mocked, the oil, the cured meat, the peppers, all of it celebrated now, all of it craved. The shame was always a lie. It just took the world a long and painful while to admit it, and a great many proud people had to swallow hard before it did. But come outside now, because once a year the shame falls away entirely, and the whole neighborhood remembers exactly who it is. It is the feast of the saint, and the street is strung end to end with lights, arches of them, a sky made by hand. There is a band. There is a statue carried on the shoulders of grown men. And there is food everywhere, from carts and windows and folding tables, the smell of sausage and onions and fried dough thick enough to lean on. For one night the food is not strange. For one night it is the whole world. It came once a year, the feast of the neighborhood's own saint, brought across the ocean from the village your people had left behind, and the whole quarter gave itself over to it completely. The preparations took days. The men strung the lights across the street from building to building, great looping arches of bulbs that turned the ordinary block into a glowing cathedral after dark. The women cooked for a week. The band practiced. And when the day came, the entire neighborhood poured out of its cramped apartments and into the street. And for a few shining days, the people who were mocked everywhere else became, in their own streets, magnificent. The heart of it was the procession. The statue of the saint, kept in the church all year, was carried out into the open on a great platform on the shoulders of the strongest men, who moved it slowly down the packed street while the band played and the people followed and the candles flickered. And the people pinned money to the statue, ribbons of dollar bills fluttering from the saint's robes, every bill a prayer and a thanks and a sacrifice from a family that had so little to give and gave anyway. It was devotion you could see, devotion made of the very dollars a family could barely spare, and it told you everything about what these people held sacred. And the food, son. The food at the feast was a thing apart, food made for eating in the street, in the open air, in a crowd, under the lights. The sausage and peppers and onions frying on great flat griddles, the smell of it rolling down the whole block, thick enough you could nearly lean against it. The fried dough, hot and crisp and buried in powdered sugar, handed to you in a paper that soaked through with the oil of it, the hard nutty nougat sold in slabs. The whole street one long open-air kitchen, the air a single glorious cloud of frying and sugar and smoke. You ate it standing up, walking, surrounded by every face you knew, the band loud in your ears, the lights blazing overhead, your people all around you proud and loud and entirely unashamed for once. There was no holding of noses here. There was no shame. This was the food in its rightful home, celebrated by the people it belonged to, out in the open where the whole world could smell it, and the people who made it did not care one bit who saw. For a few nights a year, the thing they were taught to hide became the thing they paraded down the middle of the street under a sky of homemade light. You go to festivals now, son, all polished and ticketed and arranged, and they are pleasant enough. But they were not built by people defending their own dignity. They do not carry a saint brought from a village across the sea. or flutter with the hard-spared dollars of poor, faithful families, or blaze with lights strung up by the very men who lived on that block. For a few nights each year, my old neighborhood set itself on fire with light and pride and frying sausage, and declared to a world that looked down on it that it was, in fact, beautiful. And it was right. Let us go back inside and talk about the quiet daily war that nobody ever wrote a song about, keeping food from going bad. There was no humming white refrigerator in the corner, not for a family like yours, not yet. There was an ice box, an actual box that held a block of ice, delivered up 4 flights on the back of a man who looked like he could carry the building. You learned to shop for one day at a time, to use the oldest thing first, to waste nothing, because every spoiled scrap was money thrown straight out the window. The icebox was exactly what its plain name said it was, a wooden cabinet lined with metal, with a compartment up top where a block of ice sat slowly melting, cooling the food below as it went. There was no machine in it, no motor, no hum, nothing electric at all. It worked on ice and ice alone, and ice melts, which meant the whole arrangement depended on a steady supply of it, which meant the whole arrangement depended on the Iceman. And the Iceman was a figure in your childhood, son, as real and regular as the milkman or the priest. He came on his route with his wagon, and he was built like a side of beef himself, because his whole trade was hauling great dripping blocks of ice up flight after flight of tenement stairs on his shoulder, protected by a leather pad, the water running down his back all day long. You would hear him on the stairs, you would hear the heavy block thud into the icebox, and you understood without being told that this was hard, brutal labor, and that the man doing it was keeping your supper from spoiling by the strength of his own back. But the ice only bought you a little time, a day or two at most. And so the real work fell on your mother, who fought the war against spoilage every single day of her life. She shopped for one day at a time, buying only what would be eaten before it could turn, because there was no keeping a week's worth of anything cold, and there was no money to lose to rot. She organized that icebox like a general organizing a retreat. The oldest things always in front, always used first, nothing ever pushed to the back and forgotten, because a forgotten thing was a spoiled thing, and a spoiled thing was money gone. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was lost to neglect, because neglect was a luxury the family simply could not afford. The milk that was about to turn became something cooked before it could. The bread that was hardening got its second life. The vegetable starting to wilt went into the pot that very night. Your mother held the whole inventory of that small cold box in her head at all times, knew exactly what had to be used and when, and moved through her week one careful day at a time, losing almost nothing, all without a single machine to help her, all by attention and discipline and the hard arithmetic of having little. You have a great humming machine in your kitchen now, son, and a second one, sometimes, in the garage, and they keep food cold for weeks without a thought from you. And so things get pushed to the back, things get forgotten, things go bad in there, far more than my mother ever lost, and get scraped into the bin without a second's grief, because there is always more, and it is always cheap. We won the war against spoilage so completely that we forgot it was ever a war at all. And somewhere in that easy victory, we quietly lost the habit of treating food as the precious, perishable, hard-won thing it has always truly been. Pull a stool up to the table, because in this house even the children worked. There was no sitting and watching. Small hands were good for small jobs. And so you snapped the beans. You rolled the little dumplings off the fork. You stirred what needed stirring while your arm gave out. You ran the loaf back to the bakery when it came out wrong. This was not a punishment, and it did not feel like one. It was simply how a family fed itself, every member doing a share, the youngest learning by the side of the oldest. You were part of the work. The kitchen on a big cooking day became a kind of assembly line, and every person in the family had a station fitted to their size and skill. The grown women did the work that took strength and judgment, the kneading and the rolling and the seasoning. The older children did the steady, careful jobs. And the little ones, the ones barely tall enough to see over the table edge on a stool, were handed the small, endless tasks that needed doing, but did not need much. And they did them with a seriousness that the work did not entirely deserve, proud beyond words to be useful. You snapped the beans, hundreds of them, your small fingers learning the exact place to break them. The pile of ready beans growing in the bowl while the stems and tips collected in your lap. You shelled the peas. You shaped the little dumplings, rolling each small piece of dough off the tines of a fork or down a wooden board to give it its grooves, one after another, 100 of them, 1,000, until your thumb went numb and the tray was full, and your grandmother nodded once in approval, which was worth more than gold. You stirred the pot that had to be stirred without stopping until your arm burned and an older cousin took over. And you ran the errands, because a child with fast legs was a kind of tool the kitchen could deploy. Run down to the bakery, the loaf came out wrong. Run to the cart on the corner, your mother forgot the parsley. Run up to the 3rd floor. Ask the woman there for a cup of what we are short of. You flew up and down those stairs all day on a big cooking day. The kitchen's legs, breathless and important. And you would not have traded the job for anything because it meant you mattered. You were needed. You were part of the great machine that fed the family. It was work, real work, and no one pretended otherwise. But it never once felt like a burden. And here is why. You were not working alone, off in some corner doing a chore while the family lived its life elsewhere. You were working shoulder to shoulder with everyone you loved, in the warmest room of the house, in the middle of the noise and the smell and the laughter and the arguing, learning by watching, learning by doing, the youngest hands picking up from the oldest the things that could never be written down. The work was how the knowledge passed. The work was how you were folded into the family. The work was, though you would never have called it this, a kind of love. Children do not work in kitchens now, son. We decided, with the best of intentions, that childhood should be for play and for school and for being looked after. And that is a fine and gentle thing, and I do not entirely fault it. But I will tell you what got lost. The thing that got lost was a child's certainty that he was needed, that the family depended on his small hands, that he was part of the work and therefore part of the whole. That certainty raised us. And I am not sure what, in its absence, raises children now. So here we are at the end of the table, son, and the candles are low. I have shown you the whole world of it now, the garden and the cellar, the sauce and the sweets, the shame and the feast. And the brutal truth, the real one underneath all the others, is this. Almost none of it was written down. It lived in hands and in noses and in the way a woman knew, without a clock, exactly when a thing was done. Some of it got handed to you, and some of it died in those kitchens forever. Tonight, in the only way left to me, I am handing you the rest. There were no recipes. You have to understand that completely, because it is the saddest and most important thing in the whole long story. Your mother did not cook from a card or a book. She cooked from her hands, which had been taught by her mother's hands, which had been taught by hers, all the way back down a line of women 1,000 years deep into the hills of the old country. She knew the bread was ready by its give, the sauce by its smell, the cheese by the parting of the milk, the polenta by the feel of the spoon. It was knowledge held in the body, not on paper, and the only way it ever passed from one person to the next was by standing close and watching and doing. And that is a beautiful way to carry knowledge, the most human way there is. But it is also a terribly fragile one, because when the hands that held it grew old, and the children who should have stood beside them were instead off becoming American, off in school, off in offices, off chasing a better, easier life that their parents had crossed an ocean to give them, the chain began to break. A generation looked away at the wrong moment. The old woman cooked her last sauce, and there was no one standing close enough to learn it by heart. And when she was gone, the sauce was gone with her, exactly and forever, because it had never once been written down. That is what got lost, son. Not all of it, thank God, but more than anyone wants to admit. Dishes that fed families for centuries vanished in a single generation, because the people who knew them by hand died before the people who should have learned them by hand got around to paying attention. Whole worlds of flavor and skill and patience, the bitter greens and the cheap cuts and the cellar craft, slipped away quietly while a busy, striving generation was looking the other way. Sure, there would always be time to learn it later. There was not always time. There almost never is. But some of it got handed down, and that is the other half of the truth, the half that lets me sleep. Some child did stand close. Some daughter did learn the sauce by heart. Some son did watch the bread until he knew it by its give. Some grandchild did write down, just in time, what the old hands were doing before those hands went still. The chain bent and frayed, but in many a family it did not fully break, and the knowledge crossed one more gap and lived. What you make in your own kitchen, the little you make of it, is the far end of a rope that runs back across an ocean and down 1,000 years, and you are holding it, whether you know it or not. So that is why I have told you all of this tonight, son. Not for the sake of a sad old man's memories, though I will admit there is some of that in it. I have told you because I am one of the last who remembers it by hand, and you are young, and the rope is in my fingers and reaching for yours. The candles are low now. The kitchen is quiet. And I am handing it to you, all of it, the only way I have left. Take it. Hold on. Do not let this be the generation that looks away. Let us go back to the summer garden for a moment, to the heavy purple fruit hanging low and glossy on the plant. Because here is one of the cleverest tricks your people ever pulled. The eggplant. It grew like a weed once you got it going. It cost almost nothing at the cart, and in your mother's hands it did a thing that no other vegetable could quite manage. It ate like meat. On a night when there was no meat to be had, and there were a great many such nights, a platter of eggplant could sit in the middle of the table and make a whole family forget there had ever been any other plan. It came up thick in the August garden alongside the tomatoes, and it came cheap and plentiful at the push cart, and a family watching every penny learned to love it for that alone. But the love went deeper than thrift, because eggplant, treated right, had a richness to it, a meaty heft, a way of going soft and savory and satisfying that filled you up the way the cheap vegetables almost never did. It was poor food that did not taste poor, and that, as you have learned tonight, was the highest art there was in that kitchen. Your mother had her ritual with it, and the first step was one you watched with great curiosity as a child. She sliced it, and she salted it, and she set it out under a weight, a plate with something heavy on top, and left it to weep. The bitter juices ran out of it that way, drop by drop, and what was left behind was sweet and ready. Nothing she did was an accident. Every step had a reason worked out by generations before her, and the salting and the weeping was the reason her eggplant was never bitter when other people's was. Then she fried the slices golden in the pan, in a little of the everyday fat, until they went soft and rich and tender, and from there she could take it anywhere. Layered with the August sauce and a little of the guarded cheese and baked until it bubbled, it became the dish that needed no meat and missed it not at all. A thing so good that the meatless rule of a Friday felt like a gift rather than a sacrifice. Stuffed, fried plain, with a little garlic, cooked down sweet and sour with onions and a touch of vinegar into the dish. You ate cold on a hot day. The eggplant went 100 directions and was welcome down every one of them. And here was the quiet genius of it, son, the thing I want you to hold on to. Your family did not eat eggplant because they had given up on meat and resigned themselves to less. They ate it because, in the right hands, it was not less. It was its own glorious thing, rich and deep and filling, and a platter of it in the center of the table on a meatless night was not a defeat. It was a small triumph, a poor woman taking a cheap purple vegetable and making it sit at the head of the table like a roast. You can buy a slab of meat for any night you please now, son, and so the humble eggplant has become an afterthought, a side, a thing for the health-minded. But there were whole stretches of weeks in my childhood held up entirely by that vegetable, made to taste like plenty by a woman with salt and a heavy plate and a hot pan and a great deal of accumulated wisdom. And I have never since sat down to a finer meatless supper than the one she conjured out of something that grew like a weed. It is a cold, gray afternoon now, the kind that gets into your bones, and there is a great pot on the back of the stove that has been there, in one form or another, for as long as you can remember. The soup. Not a soup made once and eaten and gone, but the soup, an ongoing thing, a living institution, a pot that absorbed whatever the kitchen could not use any other way and turned it day after day into something warm and nourishing and somehow always a little different from the day before. There was almost always a soup going, because the soup was where everything ended up, the great patient stomach of the whole kitchen, the bones saved from a rare bit of meat, the hard ends of the cheese, the rind itself, thrown in to melt and flavor, the outer leaves of vegetables too tough for anything else, the water the pasta had cooked in, the water the beans had soaked in, all of it saved, all of it poured back. Nothing drained away down the sink that still had a single thing left to give. The soup was thrift-made liquid, and it was delicious, and there is no contradiction in those two things. The greens went into it by the armful, the escarole, and the bitter wild things you had gathered, cooked down soft and dark in the broth. The beans went in, swelling and creaming the liquid as they always did. A handful of pasta, the broken bits from the bottoms of the boxes. And on a fortunate day the soup rose to something almost ceremonial. The greens married up with little meatballs no bigger than a marble. The rich old wedding soup your grandmother made when there was a reason to celebrate and sometimes when there was not. The kind of soup that tasted like an occasion in a bowl. It changed from day to day, you understand, because what went into it changed from day to day. Monday soup was thin and green. By Wednesday it had thickened, deepened, taken on the flavor of 3 days of small additions, gone richer and more complex without your mother ever once planning it that way. She simply kept the pot going, kept feeding it the odds and ends, kept it warm on the back burner, and it rewarded her by being a little better every time it was ladled out. A soup that is never quite finished is a soup that is always quietly improving. And on the coldest days, a bowl of that endless soup with a heel of stale bread dropped into the bottom of it to soften, That was the whole warm heart of winter. It cost almost nothing. It used up everything. It warmed you from the center out and sat in your stomach like ballast against the cold. And it tasted, in some impossible way, of every meal that had come before it. All the saved bones and rinds and waters, folded together into one long, unbroken thread of nourishment that ran right through the season. You open a can now, son, or a little box, and you have soup in 3 minutes, the same every single time, made in a factory 1,000 miles away. And it is fine, and it is fast, and I have eaten my share of it. But it never changes. It never improves. It never carries the memory of yesterday's meal forward into today. Never absorbs the scraps a kitchen would otherwise waste. Never sits warm and patient on the back of the stove as the quiet beating heart of the whole household. We bought our soup, and we lost the pot that never ended, and I am not certain the trade was a fair one. It is autumn now, and the great tomato day is behind you. But the work of putting up the harvest is not done, not by a long way. Because tomatoes were only the most famous of the things your family saved against the winter. All down the shelf, beside the rank of red jars, stood the others, the peppers and the eggplant and the medley of vegetables, each one captured at the peak of its season and sealed away under oil or under vinegar, so that in the dead of February you could open a jar and taste a piece of September. The peppers were the glory of it to my mind. Roasted black over the flame, their skins blistered and peeled away, the sweet, soft flesh beneath packed into jars and covered over with the good oil and a little garlic, sealed up to wait. You opened one of those jars on a gray winter day, and the smell came out like a memory, sweet and smoky and rich. And a few of those peppers on a piece of bread was a small, bright miracle in the middle of the cold, a taste of a sun that had set months before. The eggplant got the same treatment, fried or boiled, and then put up under oil with herbs and garlic, ready to crown a piece of bread or round out a winter plate. And then there was the medley, the riot of pickled vegetables in vinegar, the cauliflower and carrots and peppers and little onions all packed together, bright and crisp and sharp, a jar of pure tartness that woke up a heavy winter meal and cut through the richness of everything else on the table. Sweet under oil, sharp under vinegar, the two great methods of holding a vegetable past its time, and your family practiced both with the seriousness they deserved. It was careful work, mind you, and your mother did not take it lightly because she knew what every old woman knew, that food put up wrong could turn on you, could spoil in ways you could not always see. So she scrubbed her jars and scalded them. She made sure the vinegar was sharp enough and the oil covered everything completely. She did each step the way her mother had taught her and took no shortcuts, because the whole point of preserving was to keep food safe through the winter, and there was no sense in saving food only to have it betray you in January. The care was part of the craft. The two could not be separated. And so the autumn was a second great season of labor. After the tomatoes, a steady patient gathering in of everything the garden and the carts had offered at their peak. Jar by jar, the shelf filled up, the reds and the golds and the greens of it glowing in the low autumn light, a whole pantry full of captured summers ranked and waiting. To stand before that shelf in October was to feel rich in the only way that truly mattered to a family like yours, which was to know, with certainty, that whatever the winter brought, there would be good things to eat all the way through it. You have a whole world of vegetables available to you in January now, son, flown in fresh from the other side of the earth, peppers and eggplant in the dead of winter as though seasons no longer applied. And there is a wonder in that, I will not deny it. But you have never opened a jar in February that you sealed yourself in September, never tasted a summer you put up with your own 2 hands months before, never felt the particular quiet wealth of standing before a full shelf, knowing you had beaten the winner before it even arrived. We made everything always available, and somewhere in it, we lost the deep satisfaction of having put something by. Let us start with the eggs, and where they came from, which may surprise you. Because a good number of families in that crowded city kept their own hens, right there in the scrap of yard out back, or in a little coop knocked together on the roof, or even on the fire escape, clucking and scratching 4 floors above the street as though they had never heard of a city at all. Fresh eggs, gathered warm in the morning by a child sent up to do it, were not a thing you bought if you could possibly keep the birds to make them yourselves. The eggs were a small daily treasure, cheap to produce once you had the hens, full of nourishment, endlessly useful, and your mother treated them with the respect a precious and versatile thing deserves. A few eggs could stretch a meal, bind a dish together, turn up in the bread, enrich the pasta, or, on the right night, become the star of the table all on their own. In a kitchen built entirely around making a little go a long way, the egg was a quiet hero, and the hens that made them earned their keep many times over. But the true glory of the egg in that kitchen, son, the dish I want you to remember, was the frittata, because the frittata was the single greatest use everything dish ever invented by frugal people anywhere on earth. Whatever was left over, whatever odd end was sitting in the icebox threatening to go to waste, it all went into the frittata. The leftover greens, the scrap of cheese, a few of those preserved peppers, and most wonderfully of all, the leftover pasta itself, the cold spaghetti from the night before, bound up with beaten egg and fried in the pan into a thick golden cake that was somehow better than the meal it had been made from. That was the magic of it. Your mother could look at a collection of sad little leftovers, the kind of odds and ends that on their own were nothing, beat a few eggs over them, and produce a frittata that the whole family fell upon with genuine joy. It cooked up thick and golden, crisp at the edges, set and tender in the middle, sliced into wedges like a pie, eaten hot or cold, or stuffed cold between 2 pieces of bread for the next day's lunch pail. Nothing was wasted, everything was elevated, and a supper appeared out of what another family would have thrown away. And it was the great equalizer of the lunch pail, too. A wedge of cold frittata, eggs and greens and yesterday's pasta, tucked between bread, was one of the finest things a child could carry to school, dense and satisfying and good. And yes, it was one of the very things the other children wrinkled their noses at, never knowing they were turning up those noses at a small masterpiece of thrift and flavor. Their loss, again and always. Your mother had taken nothing and made something, and packed that something into your pail with love. And that they could not smell what they were missing was their failing, not hers. You scrape your leftovers into the bin now, son, more often than not. Or they sit forgotten in the back of that great humming machine until they have to be thrown out. And a carton of eggs comes from a store from hens you will never see. And there is no shame in the convenience of it. But I think of a child climbing to a rooftop coop to gather warm eggs, and a woman turning yesterday's scraps into a golden cake the whole family cheered for. And I see 2 things we let slip away without noticing: the keeping of our own food and the art of letting nothing go to waste. It is a Saturday now, and something is different in the whole neighborhood, a current of excitement running through every apartment on the block, because there is a wedding today. And a wedding, son, was the single greatest explosion of food and joy and abundance that a poor community ever permitted itself. For one day, the careful counting of pennies stopped entirely. For one day, the family that had scrimped and saved for months threw open its hands and gave everything it had, and the table groaned under more food than the children had ever seen in one place in their lives. It was a community effort, you understand, because no single family could have managed it alone. The aunts and the cousins and the neighbors all came together in the days before. Every kitchen on the block pressed into service, the women cooking in shifts around the clock, contributing their best dishes, their specialties, the things they were known for. The whole neighborhood poured its skill and its labor and its love into that one table. And what resulted was a feast that no amount of money could have bought, because it was not bought at all. It was made by many hands for the love of the couple and the joy of the occasion. And the abundance of it, after so much careful scarcity, was almost overwhelming. The pasta in great quantities, the meat that appeared in a fullness the family never saw on an ordinary day, the platters of the eggplant and the peppers and every good thing the season offered. And then, towering over all of it, the cookies, table after table of them, dozens of kinds, every woman's finest baking laid out in a glittering spread that the children circled like moths. The fig-stuffed ones, and the almond ones, and the delicate fried ones dusted with sugar. More sweetness in one room than most of them tasted in a year. The wine flowed from the cellars, the homemade wine that had waited in its barrels for just such a day. The band played, and the whole neighborhood danced, the old people and the young, the dances brought across the ocean and the new ones learned here, the floor shaking, the room loud and bright and alive in a way that the careful, everyday life of the block simply never was. For one shining day, the people who counted every penny spent nothing on counting at all, and the joy of that release, that permission to be lavish just once, was written on every face in the room. And at the heart of it was the oldest tradition of all, the sugared almonds, the little candy jewels that every guest carried home. 5 of them, traditionally, tied up in a small bundle, given to each person as a gift and a blessing, the bitter almond and the sweet sugar together standing for the truth that a marriage and a life would hold both. The bitter and the sweet, bound up together, given out by the handful on the happiest day, so that no one celebrating would ever quite forget that the two always came together, that they always had, that they always would. You go to weddings now, son, in great rented halls, the food brought in by strangers in vans, the whole thing arranged and paid for and forgotten by Monday. And they are lovely, I am sure, but they were not cooked through the night by every aunt on the block. They do not represent a poor community pouring out everything it had for one day of glory. And I think of those sugared almonds most of all, the bitter and the sweet tied up together and pressed into your hand as you left. And I think that our people, who knew more bitterness than most, understood something about sweetness that the easy abundance of your time may never quite teach you. You have to know the one, son, to truly taste the other. So that is the whole of it, son. The candles have burned down to almost nothing now, and the kitchen has gone quiet around us. And somewhere down the hall, that old coffee pot is finally cold. It is still 1934, in the way that it will always be. 1934 whenever the two of us sit at this table together, and I have shown you nearly everything I know. Let us close the circle before the night lets us go. You asked me at the start what a man did for a glass of wine when the government had decided he could not have one. Well, now you know. He went down into the dark of his own cellar, and he pressed the grapes his fathers had pressed before him, and he made his wine in barrels he guarded like sleeping children, and he poured it on his own table next to the bread, and he kept his mouth shut and his family fed. The law could empty the saloons. It could not reach down those cellar stairs. Some things a people will simply not surrender, and a glass of honest wine at supper was one of them. You asked how a woman fed a husband, 4 children, and whatever cousin wandered up the stairs, all on a butcher's bill that would not cover your coffee this morning. And now you know that too. She did it with a pound of macaroni and a little imagination. She did it with beans, and bitter greens gathered free from an empty lot, and the cheap cuts the butcher could barely sell, and an eggplant that ate like meat, and a soup pot that never quite emptied. She did it by wasting nothing, ever, down to the last drop of whey and the last heel of bread. She did it by being, though no school ever gave her a paper to say so, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. You asked why the other children held their noses when you opened your lunch, and why those very same children would sell their souls for that exact sandwich today. And that, son, is the brutal truth I promised you, the hard stone at the bottom of all this warmth. They held their noses because the world had taught them that your people and your food were something less. And they line up around the block for it now because the world was wrong, and it took the world a long and shameful while to admit it. The garlic they mocked, the oil, the cured meat that hung in the cellar dark beside the coal, all of it beloved now, all of it craved. The shame was always a lie. The food was always magnificent. It just had to wait for the world to catch up. And it did catch up, at last, which is the sweetest part of the whole bitter story. The food that was born of having nothing grew up to feed everyone. The cooking that marked your family as outsiders became the most loved cooking in the whole country. That is what your people did, son. They took poverty and prejudice and a hard new land that did not want them, and out of those poor ingredients, with nothing but their hands and their memory and their stubborn refusal to be made small, they made something beautiful enough to outlast every single person who ever looked down on them. That is the truth I most wanted you to have. Now, before I let you go, if this old man's stories kept you good company tonight, do me the small kindness of tapping that like button, and subscribe if you would care to sit with me again. Leave a comment down below and tell me what hung in your own family's cellar, or what your grandmother kept in the pot she never let anyone touch. I read every one of them, and they mean more to me than you know. And remember, we are on Spotify now, so if you would rather close your eyes and just listen, the link is sitting right there in the description, patient as ever. It is late now, son. The kitchen is dark and warm and smells faintly of everything it has ever cooked. Rest easy tonight, wherever you are. Hold on to the rope I handed you, and know that somewhere, on an ordinary evening in 1934, a whole family sat around one table, fed on almost nothing, rich beyond measure, and that they would be so very glad to know you were thinking of them. Good night. Sleep well. I will keep the coffee warm.